A follow-up to Hyrule Warriors wasn't really too surprising, but seeing that the sequel turned out to be a sort of prequel to Breath of the Wild is something I don't think most people actually expected. Hyrule Warriors was one of the most beloved games from the Wii U era, and maybe calling it beloved is a little much, but given that the Zelda series was in sort of a limbo state during Breath of the Wild's development during the mid-2010s, it was almost a light-in-the-dark scenario for the Zelda fanbase. Regardless, by most accounts, Hyrule Warriors was seen as pretty damn successful. It rated decently among fans and critics, it brought a lot of new eyes to the Musou style of hack and slash genre, and it even sold 1 million units on the Wii U, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you factor in that there were only ever 13.5 million consoles sold, having an install base of around 7% is still pretty damn impressive. It was clear there was a demand for this style of game going forward, and not just with different IPs, but another Zelda-centric entry. Meanwhile, Breath of the Wild release coinciding with the launch of the Nintendo Switch, and to say this is one of Nintendo's biggest wins in the past decade would be downplaying things quite a bit. They went from being an afterthought in one generation to absolutely cleaning house with the next, with the Switch being one of the best-selling video game consoles ever, and Breath of the Wild was a very large part of that. When you kind of put those two series of events side by side, it might be easy to connect the dots to see how we got to Age of Calamity. And yeah, in hindsight, I think everything lined up perfectly for this, that even when the game was announced, there wasn't as much of a shock as there were people saying, yeah, that totally makes sense that they do that, I'm down for this. A prequel to one of Nintendo's biggest games ever, in the style of what was by far the most popular Zelda spin-off? Yeah, sign me right up. This sounds like something that is going to appeal to both fans of Breath of the Wild's world and story, as well as the people who enjoyed the gameplay from Hyrule Warriors. And if you wanted to give a generalized overview of the game, you could probably just say that. But I think there's a little bit more to discuss about Age of Calamity, because on one hand, this game has some absolutely massive improvements over the original Hyrule Warriors that makes it a potential stronger experience. However, there are also a number of things that I think were not addressed or were doubled down on, or were removed entirely, or were compromised to bring us the game that we have here today, and it almost leaves me with the question of, do I even like this game more than the first or not? And a lot of these things really started to become more apparent as I ventured deeper into my playthrough. This left me a little conflicted. I undoubtedly enjoyed my time with Age of Calamity, but as I played more and more, I was reminded of my playthrough with the original Hyrule Warriors and the several things that I think that game did a better job at. You tend to do a lot of drifting away in thought with these types of games as you mow down hundreds of enemies and grind out materials, so I had a lot of time to process exactly what I wanted to say here, and to summarize it all up, it's this. Age of Calamity is good, but I think it could have been a little bit better. One of the most common discussions this game had since its announcement, and honestly, one of the biggest questions that many people who played Breath of the Wild but skipped Age of Calamity might be wondering is this game's story actually canon to the events of Breath of the Wild? The answer to that question is no. Well, technically yes. Sort of? I don't know, man, it's weird. Age of Calamity actually begins during the Calamity itself, when Hyrule Castle is being attacked by Ganon's forces. However, inside Zelda's room, she has this baby guardian BB-8 looking thing stowed away in a box that wakes up and escapes through a time portal to find Link, Zelda, and Impa to help put a stop to the Calamity, thus creating a new timeline, something this series is no stranger to at this point. This was most certainly done to give a bit more creative freedom for the story, since we all kind of know exactly what happened before Breath of the Wild that led up to the events of that game. The story's whole focus was piecing bits of Link's memories back together to see the events that came before. This allows developer Omega Force to not just take a few liberties here and there with the plot, but flat out completely change the way that many of these events turn out, which I'm not really sure if I like it all that much. Going in, I was kind of expecting this game to be the real prequel to Breath of the Wild, since the most interesting thing about Breath of the Wild's story took place in the past. I was really excited to have a story where we got to spend more time with the champions, we get a better viewpoint of Zelda gaining her powers, and we get an actual game that has the heroes lose for once. And to be fair, we do get some of that, but it's kind of just a mixed bag. All the stuff with the champions are great. In fact, if you love the cutscenes in Breath of the Wild, these are done in the same exact style, and there are a ton of them here too. This game honestly might have the most voice cutscenes out of any Zelda game. And as someone who liked Breath of the Wild's take on these characters and its presentation interpretation. I was loving watching these cutscenes too, even when things didn't exactly stick the landing. Zelda's gaining of powers is a great example of this. We saw in Breath of the Wild the struggle that she had to go through and the sacrifice she ultimately had to make in order for her to awaken to her true potential. And she does go through a bit more of that here too, with probably the best bits being her arguments with the King of Hyrule. But the catalyst of her awakening to her power is such a downgrade from Breath of the Wild. I'm all for playing around with alternate ideas for the story, but without spoiling anything, the events leading up to her getting her power were nowhere near as intense or emotionally captivating as Link almost dying and Zelda stepping in to save him and the rest of the kingdom. Probably the most radical change that was made comes about halfway through the game when the modern day champions of the four tribes go back in time to assist with the oncoming calamity. Before that happened, I was thinking to myself how much more grounded this story was compared to the original Hyrule Warriors, but the second that they are introduced into the story, it just completely jumps the shark in my opinion. And I know it was done to get more characters on the roster, I'm not blind to that fact. I just don't think that incorporating them in the main story was gracefully done here, or is really all that good of an idea in the first place. The performances were all great at least. You know, as strange as it might be to see Mipha, Sidon, and younger Sidon in a scene together, the cutscenes still have a good amount of heart, and the voice performances are all on par with what you'd expect for Breath of the Wild. One thing that I really didn't like though was the ending. Just don't get me started on it. If you want definitive proof that this game isn't in the same timeline as Breath of the Wild, just look up what happens in the ending and then you will completely understand. Much like the original Hyrule Warriors, we also have some new characters created for this adventure too, but unlike the original Hyrule Warriors, I actually like these guys for the most part. Main reason here is that they all actually fit a lot better than the OCs from the first game. You don't have a Hatsune Miku clone or a lady that looks like she was ripped from Mortal Kombat or a generic dark wizard. Well, okay, I guess we do have this guy as a generic dark wizard, but you get my point. Astor here is essentially our Zant or Aghanim for this game, being the main antagonist before Ganon shows up, and he is just fine, not really too remarkable. We also have Tarako, which is the baby guardian I mentioned earlier, and yeah, it's cute I suppose, but it very much gives that BB-8 energy of feeling like a character designed to sell merchandise, and characters like this are honestly a dime a dozen. Then there is Suga. I like Suga. One of my personal favorite characters from Breath of the Wild was Master Koga from the Yiga clan, and seeing him have this guy who just takes everything so seriously and doesn't bat an eye to Koga's shenanigans is absolutely hilarious. I love these guys as a bumbling duo as secondary antagonist. They're honestly just some of the best parts of the story. So overall, while the actual story I thought was a bit of a mess, the presentation itself definitely made up for it, and that carries over to the graphics and sound design too, especially when it comes to the music. God, there are so many good remixes and new renditions of Breath of the Wild tunes. I highly recommend this OST. Now, given that this game is utilizing Breath of the Wild's art style instead of the entirety of the Zelda series, things are a lot more cohesive here. I really thought it was weird how Hyrule Warriors did things by having enemies like the cartoony ones from Skyward Sword on the screen at the same time as the more realistic ones from Twilight Princess. It just sort of looked surreal and like it just shouldn't exist. I never really felt that when I was looking at Age of Calamity because I've seen all of these things together before, but that also kind of leads into another problem. A big strength of Hyrule Warriors was how it paid respect to the entire Zelda series. Yeah, it leaned a little too much on Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword, but after all the DLC, there was something for nearly every Zelda fan to sink their teeth into, regardless of which game was your favorite. It was, for all intents and purposes, the celebration of the franchise. Age of Calamity, by comparison, is just focusing on Breath of the Wild, which I do love, but instead of honoring a franchise with 30 years worth of games, we are instead paying homage to a game that came out 3 years before this one was released. Instead of hearing sounds like the Song of Time being played, we're hearing the noise from the Sheikah Slate. Instead of fighting King Dodongo from Ocarina of Time in full HD for the first time, we are once again having another fight with another Guardian. All of the references being from a game that came out 3 years prior just doesn't hit the same nostalgia spots that we saw in Hyrule Warriors, which isn't this game's fault, but it is kind of just the way things are. And that's not to discredit the way that Age of Calamity pulls from all corners of Breath of the Wild, because some of the stuff they incorporate into characters' movesets, like the Horse God or Koga eating bananas, or all the moves from Maz Koshia's boss fight, is super awesome to see. I would really expect nothing less of this team when it comes to the flashy moves in combat. And that's another great thing about this. Given that this game was designed on the Switch, there was room for a lot more enemies and NPCs on the screen at any given time, and far more dynamic locations to fight at. They were all pretty much ripped wholesale from Breath of the Wild like you would expect, but visually speaking, the gameplay looks far more lively than what we saw in the original Hyrule Warriors. There is a big price to pay with this though, and this may single-handedly be the thing that kills the game for most people, the performance. So, full disclosure, I'm playing this game on my Switch 2, so the performance you would probably expect to be pretty good, or at least a vast improvement for how it was on the Switch 1, and that's sort of the case. The game is locked to 30 FPS, and on the Switch 2, it thankfully stays pretty consistently close to that cap. It is still very blurry, so this is something that I'm crossing my fingers for a Switch 2 upgrade in the future, but given how we have Age of Imprisonment on the horizon, I wouldn't be surprised to see that this is just the way that this game stays. So performance on the Switch 2 isn't great, but it's at least playable. The Switch 1 performance, on the other hand, I have heard nothing but abysmal things about, with many even claiming to experience frame drops into the single digits during heavier combat segments. I can personally play a game at a lower than average frame rate, especially after I give my eyes some time to adjust, but this is simply inexcusable. I know the Switch 1's strong suit was never its performance capabilities, but the original Hyrule Warriors was still at 60 FPS. Even putting my weird overheating issues aside, Hyrule Warriors ran better on my Switch 1 than Age of Calamity does on my Switch 2. That's a huge fucking problem. Because of this, Age of Calamity is often considered to be one of the worst games for the Switch when it comes to its performance, right up there with Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, Mortal Kombat 1, and WWE 2K18. It's honestly a real shame, because I know it probably stopped a ton of people from playing more than the first few missions, which really sucks, because when it comes to actually playing Age of Calamity, there are so many things that I think it absolutely nails. The original Hyrule Warriors, while being a pretty fun game, was something that I considered to be as vast as an ocean, but about as deep as a puddle. Hyrule Warriors had enough content to last literally hundreds of hours, but the gameplay loop was a little too bare bones and grindy to keep me interested for even 10% of what the game had to offer. So Age of Calamity was something that I thought could really use some fat trimming and maybe some expanded ideas with the moment-to-moment gameplay. And for the most part, Age of Calamity does a pretty good job of this. Now, instead of a bunch of various modes that Hyrule Warriors had, everything is confined into the game's story. You essentially look over a map of Breath of the Wild's open world and can select which missions and side objectives to do, or which upgrades or shop items to purchase. This can make the game feel a little too constrained to navigating menus, but thankfully Age of Calamity has things divided up into tabs that you can use to quickly find what you're looking for. If you want a character-specific mission or upgrade, they're all in one tab, while all the shops and training areas are at another. That being said, much like the first Hyrule Warriors, there's going to be a lot of menu cleanup, as I like to call it. Doing things like either upgrading or selling your weapons so you don't hit the cap, choosing which food to make to give you buffs in battle, seeing the next mission and realizing one of your characters you're required to use is underleveled, and then finding the means to quickly scrounge up rubies in order to level them up. I'd wager a solid 25% of my game time was just sitting in this menu and organizing stuff. Admittedly, I am also sort of missing the adventure mode from the first game with its unique gimmicks for every map. I will say I do appreciate how Age of Calamity does keep all of those side objectives while also keeping everything consolidated to one place. This in turn also really cuts down on game time, since you don't need to grind out certain items in order to access these missions. As soon as you unlock them, you can do them right away. That's not to say that this game won't have any resource grinding, mind you. This still is a Musou game after all. There is still a ton of grinding that needs to be done for upgrading your character's kits and weapons, often requiring the same missions to be run again and again, but at least there is one less prerequisite for doing these optional missions now. And while I did say that they lowered the amount of optional missions, that doesn't mean there isn't still a lot to do. and again, it can debatably be too much for a lot of people. After I completed the story mission, I always got a kick of seeing just how much optional stuff unlocks all at once. I am someone who goes into a game with the mindset that if I really love what I'm seeing, I'm gonna do my best to do everything I can. Age of Calamity started like that for me, but with every new story mission completed, I just saw how much more side stuff there was, and I saw how much the game was asking me to do, and I ultimately decided to tap out on that venture. It's there for completionists, but I had more than my fill with the main game. It's kind of weird starting the gameplay section of these videos with talking about the optional stuff, but after playing both these games, I'm starting to see that this is a core component to this style of game in the same way that large-scale battles and flashy attacks are. The main story follows a very similar structure to how they were in Hyrule Warriors, where there are multiple objectives that need to be accomplished, all while you protect your bases and ensure no one dies on the battlefield. That being said, there are a number of things that are different from how they were in the original Hyrule Warriors, and not all of them are exactly for the better. One of the things I will say is undoubtedly improved are the maps. They are just head and shoulders above everything that we saw in the first game. I thought many of the maps in that game were aesthetically pleasing, but they more or less were just a series of square rooms that were connected by some linear hallways with next to no elevation to be found. Age of Calamity is still sort of like that, but since they reuse level design from Breath of the Wild, it feels a lot less artificial. Gerudo Town, Zora's Domain, the Great Plateau actually look and feel like how they were in Breath of the Wild, albeit at a bit of a smaller scale or slightly different because of this game taking place in the past. And I can't really imagine going back to how they were before now. The other thing that I will say is a definitive upgrade is that the missions are now a bit shorter in length, usually lasting about 15 to 20 minutes tops, with a lot of the side ones sometimes taking less than 5. This is the pace that I feel suits this type of game much better, since none of these missions overstay their welcome. I remember in the original Hyrule Warriors that some missions dragged on beyond the half-an-hour mark, and it was miserable if you failed and had to start over. Age of Calamity thankfully has some checkpoints here and there that will allow you to pick up from particular segments of certain missions, which makes the prospect of potentially failing a mission not as much of a punishment. Which is a good thing, because while I wouldn't say you're going to fail these missions all the time, Age of Calamity isn't exactly a walk in the park either. This game's difficulty is kind of weird. Like, there are some things that are a bit more challenging than the original Hyrule Warriors, but then there are other things that kind of make you wonder why they don't seem to come up at all. Lost conditions, for example, are a big one here. In the original Hyrule Warriors, there are plenty of ways to fail a mission. You could lose all of your hearts, run out of time, fail to complete your objective, have an ally you were supposed to protect flee, or have your base be taken over by the enemy, and all these were very realistic ways on how you could potentially lose the game. In my playthrough of Age of Calamity, I played on the standard difficulty for all the missions, and there was not a single instance where I lost a mission due to an NPC fleeing or my base being taken over. In fact, I was never even put in any danger of having that happen, and I made no effort to even attempt at defending either of those things since it was something that never really came up. I think part of the fun with the original Hyrule Warriors was that sort of back and forth and multitasking on a mission. Having to take and hold a keep to maintain a stronger footing in battle, having to strategically place your characters to ensure they were in spots that you can swap to in a pinch, that was part of the macro play, and that aspect feels almost removed in Age of Calamity. There was one mission where I needed to take out multiple enemies in quick succession, but instead of preemptively moving my characters to certain areas, I just controlled Link the entire time and ran around the map since he was the most over-leveled and could dispatch of things more efficiently. And I don't think I should have been allowed to get away with that. Couple that with the fact that a lot of the mission types from Hyrule Warriors either aren't present or aren't as common here. Most of the missions pretty much revolve around you killing a certain number of enemies within a time limit, or capturing particular targets, or defeating bosses with little to no variation. There are a few missions where you have to escort an NPC, but I have literally lost track of them and had them be attacked for several minutes while I zoned out and did something else, only to return to see that they're still at 75% HP. There's no 3 army battles, there's barely any defense missions. Hell, even the stupid quiz missions are gone now. And I know that a lot of these things do kind of pad out the mission time, which I said was a little bit too much in OG Hyrule Warriors, but I still feel like there's a balance to be struck here that can offer variety and engaging gameplay without being overly long. It's because of these things that I ended up walking away from Age of Calamity's missions feeling less engaged than I did before. There was still some fun to be had, but I also found it far easier to turn my brain off and just kind of go with the flow, which I already thought the original Hyrule Warriors did a fine enough job with, but the larger scale strategy at least was something that I had to be aware of in order to be successful. I don't really have to do that here, and maybe the higher difficulties ramp things up a little bit, but I still feel like these systems should have had some role to play in what's considered to be the normal difficulty option, but unfortunately, I did not find that here, which I have to say is a pretty big letdown. So with everything being scaled back in the strategy management aspects, where does Age of Calamity's difficulty come from? What area of this game has the most depth now? Was there anything that actually saw real massive improvements? Or what is even my favorite thing about this game now? Well, the answer to all of those questions is the same: the combat. I think Age of Calamity absolutely clears Hyrule Warriors when it comes to its combat, which in my opinion is the most important part of the game. It's far from perfect. In fact, there are a couple things that do bother me a little bit, but for the most part, I think this game is an all-around step up over the original. Let's start with maybe one of the things that we can say is actually a net loss: the roster. The original Hyrule Warriors had a massive roster of 31 characters after all of the DLC, with a few of them even having fully different movesets based on the weapons that they chose, which effectively made them into their own unique characters. Hyrule Warriors had nearly 30 years worth of games to pull from, and it featured characters like you'd expect, such as Link, Zelda, and Ganondorf, but they also had tons of side characters like Impa who have appeared throughout the series, or even some one-offs like Darunia, or some original characters like Linkle, and they even had some more out there picks like Agatha from Twilight Princess. The roster in OG Hyrule Warriors was something that I think the only way they can improve on is if you just added more characters to what was already there. It was nearly perfect. Age of Calamity only focuses on Breath of the Wild, which, while I think there's a good amount of content to pull from there, it just doesn't come close to comparing to a nearly 3-decade-long vault to pull inspiration from. We've only got 21 characters this time, and the only ones with alternative movesets based on their weapons are Link and Zelda. The roster has about everyone you expect if you played Breath of the Wild, from Link, Zelda, the champions from before the Calamity, the modern day champions, a younger version of Impa, Master Koga. You even get some more out there picks like Hestu, the Great Fairy, Monk Maz Koshia. Even Purah and Robbie are playable with the DLC. Strangely, no cast though. I would have thought he would have made it in for sure, but whatever. So while the roster is undoubtedly a little weaker in the names and numbers department, Omega Force actually ended up making these characters feel much more defined instead, which personally, I think I kind of prefer. When making your way through the main game in OG Hyrule Warriors, you could realistically spam Y and then occasionally hit X for combo finishers until your meter fills up, and then follow that up with a special attack, and you will basically be okay with the vast majority of characters, especially the non-DLC ones, which were on the more basic side of things. In Age of Calamity, you can still kind of do that spammy playstyle, but now a lot more of the characters are more specialized that if you want to play them properly, you're incentivized to learn how they work. You still have characters such as Link who are pretty bog standard, but there are far less characters like that overall now. Some of my personal favorites here were Impa for her ability to create clones of herself that could easily farm her special gauge up super quickly thanks to her ability to clear trash packs, or King Rome for having this almost Devil May Cry style of stance switching between combos, or Urbosa for hitting the charge button at the right time during a combo to instantaneously fill some of her lightning gauge. All of this was super satisfying stuff. There are, of course, some characters I could not wrap my head around too, such as Zelda utilizing the Sheikah Slate abilities, or Master Koga for being a joke character that was a little too punishing if you did an incorrect combo, or Hestu, who I have no idea how to play properly at all. Which, in a weird way, this roster now reminds me a bit more of a fighting game, since while everyone plays generally similar, there are some characters I know the intricacies with a little bit better than I do others, but that really gives the roster some much needed depth. Even some of the combos are different between characters now. It's no Devil May Cry or Bayonetta when it comes to this sort of stuff, but it's still a pretty remarkable improvement over the original Hyrule Warriors. Also have these sections where you actually get to control the divine beasts now. I wouldn't say that I love them or even necessarily like them all too much, but they are pretty interesting. The beasts pack a lot of firepower, but they're also sort of clunky and awkward to control, especially because sometimes you can get caught on terrain, and since you're in first person when you're in these, it can be a little bit more difficult to realize what's going on. But the ability to kill literally tens of thousands of enemies within the span of a couple minutes is a thrill that I don't think you can really get in any other Zelda game. What I also like a lot more is how the game incorporates the item system. In the first game, you had this wheel of various different items from Zelda series that you mainly just used when an icon came up during a boss fight in order to stun it to build up its stagger bar. The problem with this was that scrolling through the item wheel was very clunky, so you would stick to the item you need to for boss fights, and then maybe occasionally switch over to the ocarina or the bottle if you needed them. In this game, one of the two buttons will bring up your options for items for use. The first box will let you use healing items, assuming that you have enough food, or it'll also allow you to use one of the elemental rods. The rods will cast a projectile on top of where you aim it that can stun many of the bosses. They're even more effective if you use the fire or ice rod on the opposite type of enemy, or you use the lightning rod when an enemy is near water. See, that's a much better use for an elemental system than whatever Hyrule Warriors 1 had going on. These rods do have a limited usage though, so if you want more of them, you'll have to farm the Wizrobes of the corresponding element. The other menu brings up your Sheikah Slate abilities, and these have varying degrees of usefulness. They of course can all stun enemies if the icon comes up, but some, such as Magnesis, can actually pick up bits of the environment or projectiles to toss back at your foes. By far, the best one here is Stasis. Using this when an enemy has their stagger gauge exposed will give you more time to wail on it, and if you combine that with the instantaneous ability to bring up a stagger gauge with the rods, you can make some bosses an absolute joke by stun locking them and hammering them with powerful attacks. Because you have the ability to call any of your Sheikah Slate powers at the press of a button, now enemies will have more than one weakness at any given time, which makes for a much more reactionary combat. You can even do a perfect dodge in a flurry rush, or go for headshots like Breath of the Wild for some extra stagger damage. This makes your character feel far more dangerous in any given situation, and while the enemies definitely have a wider variety of attacks in their movesets, they can go down incredibly easy given how many options you have. The tough part here is really learning everything you can do, and once you get over that hurdle, this game is more or less won. The only thing enemies will really have to throw at you is having increased health bars, which most certainly can happen on some of the later missions, and let me say, filling a boss's stagger bar over 5 times before the fight is over is definitely a bit much. I really would have preferred that if you filled it up 3 times or so, you would just get a kill shot. Maybe something similar to how Sekiro handles things, I don't know. It's the only real damper on what I consider to be an overall massive step up to the combat sandbox. The new and varied characters' movesets are just on another level from what we saw in the first Hyrule Warriors. The ability to use your items with some quick button presses makes for far more fluid encounters, and this was all done with the honestly more limited scope that Age of Calamity has to offer, and I think that's something to be appreciated. I left Age of Calamity enjoying what I played, but not totally sure what I ultimately felt about it. Going in, I expected the game to have some things that it scaled back a bit, mainly being the roster, the enemy variety, things of that nature. I also expected the game to have some minor improvements across the board, but be kind of more of the same as the original Hyrule Warriors. And I suppose that was kind of true, but at the same time, I felt the things that were improvements were actually really great, while the things that aren't as good are weird things to not have anymore. The lack of needing any real strategy or having battle conditions that just seemingly never came into play was a huge letdown. But the far more interesting character kits kept the moment-to-moment gameplay generally more engaging than the original, so it still felt more fun in the moment. The cutscenes, music, the presentation, all that stuff kept a ton of the same charm from Breath of the Wild, but the performance, especially on the Switch one, were simply inexcusable. Overall, I can say that Age of Calamity is a good game, especially on the Switch 2 where the performance is far more stable. Do I like it more than the original Hyrule Warriors though? Well, if I was to compare the base games to one another, I would say it's a really close race. I like them both for different reasons. I would probably give the edge to Age of Calamity though, but both of these games did have DLC, And while Age of Calamities definitely does add more of what's already there, which is always great, the DLC for the original Hyrule Warriors takes a good game and makes it into a great one. So I have to say it's the overall winner here. Especially when you consider the fact that Hyrule Warriors on the Switch has all the DLC baked in, and it's another $20 if you want to get that for Age of Calamity. I think the choice is very clear. Nevertheless, both are good games, both are worth your time. I think this game still has a lot that you're not going to find in the first century, which is why that I can still recommend Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity to you.